It was July 1967. The air in the A Shao Valley was a physical weight, 100 degrees of heat saturated with 100% humidity. It was an atmosphere you didn't just breathe but wore. For the men of the 101st Airborne Division, sweat was a constant companion, leaching salt and strength from their bodies. They were ghosts in a green hell, hunting an enemy who was born of that hell, an enemy who could live on a handful of rice and the certainty of his convictions. The war here was primal. It was mud, blood, and the metallic taste of fear. Then a sound. Not the crump of mortars or the angry buzz of an AK-47. It was a familiar, rhythmic whump 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 that grew from a distant dragonfly into a roaring, percussive force. A UH-1 Iroquois, a Huey, descended from the brassy sky, its rotors bending the suffocating jungle canopy. It wasn't bringing ammunition. It wasn't bringing medevac stretchers. It was the daily resupply chopper, a routine delivery from a world away. Hidden in a spider hole less than 200 meters from the hastily cleared landing zone, a North Vietnamese Army regular, a young man named Nguyen Van Hung, watched through a pair of captured American binoculars. He had been tracking this unit for 2 days. He had seen their fatigue. He had noted their patrol patterns. He believed he understood them. They were soft, decadent, reliant on their machines. They would break. It was inevitable. The Huey touched down in a storm of dust and clipped leaves. Soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, unloading crates of sea rations, water, and mail from home. Then, something else emerged. A soldier carried a large, insulated green container, the kind Hung had seen before, usually holding hot food. But this was different. The soldiers crowded around it, not with the grim necessity of men taking on fuel, but with the giddy excitement of children. A sergeant opened the container. A plume of white vapor, impossibly cold, ghosted into the oppressive heat and vanished. He took out a metal scoop and began doling out portions into their canteen cups. It was ice cream. In the middle of the A Shao Valley, one of the most contested and brutal landscapes of the entire war, the Americans were eating strawberry ice cream. Nguyen Van Hung lowered his binoculars. His hands trembled slightly. It was not the weapon in the American soldier's hand that chilled him. It was not the helicopter that had just departed with a casual roar. It was the scoop of frozen dessert. In that moment, the war ceased to be a simple contest of will and ideology. It became something else entirely. He was not fighting an army. He was fighting a factory that could deliver the impossible to the middle of hell, simply because it could. What he didn't know was that he was witnessing the arrival of the weapon that would systematically, psychologically, and materially dismantle his entire world. The ideology of the North Vietnamese and their Vietcong allies was forged in scarcity and hardened by decades of colonial resistance. It was a belief system that sanctified hardship. To suffer for the cause was a virtue. To endure deprivation was a sign of moral and spiritual superiority. Their propaganda posters didn't show gleaming machines. They showed determined peasants with rifles, sinewy porters carrying impossible loads, and heroic soldiers who could merge with the jungle itself. Their entire logistical network, the legendary Ho Chi Minh Trail, was a testament to this philosophy. It was not a road, but a complex web of footpaths, tunnels, and hidden way stations, a living artery of men, women, and even children moving supplies south on their backs, on bicycles reinforced to carry hundreds of pounds, and in small, heavily camouflaged trucks that moved only at night. A North Vietnamese soldier heading south might march for 6 months, his entire sustenance a bag of rice and whatever the jungle provided. His weapon was his sacred trust. His ammunition was counted and conserved with religious fervor. Their leaders reinforced this worldview. General Vo Nguyen Giap, the architect of their military strategy, spoke of a people's war where the spirit of the revolutionary masses would overcome the technological might of the imperialist aggressor. They were told the Americans were paper tigers, a society rotted from within by consumerism and comfort. They were mercenaries, not patriots, who would quickly lose their stomach for a protracted, painful fight. There was a brutal logic to it. An American soldier was a product of the most abundant society in human history. He had grown up with refrigerators, automobiles, and television sets. He expected regular meals, clean clothes, and a certain level of comfort. The North Vietnamese leadership believed this was America's fatal weakness. They were convinced that by denying the Americans set-piece battles and dragging them into a war of endurance in the jungle, they would break their spirit. The pampered Westerner, they theorized, could not withstand the same level of hardship as the Vietnamese revolutionary. This belief was stated plainly. A captured Vietcong directive read, "The American soldier is accustomed to a high standard of living. He is not used to the jungle. We will let the jungle, the heat, the insects, and the lack of comfort be our allies. They will tire, they will sicken, and the fight will evaporate." They saw the evidence everywhere. They saw the sheer volume of material the Americans discarded. A captured American firebase was a treasure trove. Half-empty cans of food, discarded boots with only minor tears, empty brass casings by the thousands, wooden ammunition crates that could be repurposed to build bunkers. To the Vietcong, this was not a sign of wealth. It was a sign of grotesque, almost sinful waste. It confirmed their belief in the enemy's decadence. They mocked the American need for constant resupply, for helicopters to bring them hot food and mail. They saw it as a logistical umbilical cord that, once cut, would cause the entire enterprise to wither and die. They didn't understand that the umbilical cord was not a weakness. It was the weapon. It was the entire point. The American way of war was not to endure hardship. It was to export a system that made hardship irrelevant. The initial shock for many North Vietnamese and Vietcong soldiers came not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet aftermath. It was the discovery of the enemy's refuse. A Vietcong guerrilla, after a skirmish, might crawl through the undergrowth to find the American position, hoping to scavenge a weapon or a few rounds of ammunition. Instead, he would find a landscape of casual, inexplicable plenty. He would find empty cans of Coca-Cola, the iconic red and white logo, a strange glyph from another universe. He would pick one up, the metal still cool, a few sweet drops still inside. He had been told the Americans were his enemy, monsters who had come to destroy his homeland. But this object spoke of something else. It spoke of a world with enough spare sugar, aluminum, and industrial capacity to ship millions of these trivial drinks halfway around the world to its soldiers in a war zone. He might find discarded C-ration tins, not just one or two, but piles of them. He would open one and find packed-in fruit cocktail and heavy syrup, or pound cake sealed in a vacuum-packed container. This was not mere sustenance. It was a luxury beyond the comprehension of a man whose diet was rice and fermented fish sauce. And the Americans simply ate it and threw the can away. This was the first crack in the ideological armor. The propaganda said the Americans were weak and decadent, but the evidence on the ground suggested they were something far more terrifying. They were powerful, so powerful that their definition of trash was a feast, so powerful that they could afford to be wasteful on a scale that dwarfed the entire logistical capacity of the North Vietnamese state. The first direct human contact often amplified this cognitive dissonance. When a North Vietnamese soldier was captured, his initial experience was one of terror and expectation of torture. What he often received instead was a cigarette and a canteen of cold water. In a field hospital, he would be treated by a doctor with sterile equipment and anesthetic, often receiving a level of medical care superior to what a North Vietnamese general would get in Hanoi. One captured NVA officer, interrogated in a well-lit, air-conditioned room at the American base in Da Nang, was offered a cold bottle of Coca-Cola. He refused it, believing it to be poisoned. His interrogator, an American captain, simply shrugged, opened the bottle, and drank half of it himself before pushing it back across the table. The officer stared at the condensation beating on the green glass bottle. He had marched for 5 months to reach the South. He had watched men in his unit die of malaria and dysentery. The concept of a refrigerated beverage was so alien, so deeply symbolic of the chasm between their two worlds that it broke something inside him. He drank the soda, and then he began to talk. This was the catalyst. It wasn't the threat of violence. It was the casual, effortless display of a system of overwhelming abundance. The can of soda, the pack of cigarettes, the clean bandage, these were not mere trifles. They were ambassadors of an industrial logic that was more persuasive and more demoralizing than any leaflet drop or loudspeaker broadcast. They announced, in a language that needed no translation, "We have so much of everything that we can give it to our enemies. How can you possibly hope to win?" The numbers told the story, and the story they told was of a contest so lopsided it bordered on the absurd. The war in Vietnam was not a conflict between two armies. It was a conflict between a modern industrial superpower and a pre-industrial agrarian society. The battlefield was merely the stage where this disparity was made brutally manifest. Let's begin with the ports. The American war effort in Vietnam was enabled by the construction of a logistical infrastructure from scratch. The port at Cam Ranh Bay, a sleepy fishing inlet in 1965, was transformed by United States Navy Seabees and private contractors into one of the busiest deep-water ports on the planet. By 1967, its massive piers could handle deep-draft cargo ships, tankers, and ammunition vessels simultaneously. At its peak, Cam Ranh Bay, along with the ports of Da Nang and Saigon, was handling over 1 million tons of dry cargo every single month. 1 million tons. To put that into perspective, the entire estimated throughput of the Ho Chi Minh Trail for the entire year of 1967 was roughly 60,000 tons. The Americans were landing more supplies in 2 days than the North Vietnamese could move south in an entire month. The disparity was not a matter of degree. It was a matter of orders of magnitude. These ships carried everything. They carried the obvious: tanks, helicopters, artillery pieces, and ammunition. The sheer volume was staggering. Over 76 million tons of munitions were expended by the United States in Southeast Asia. That is more than double the tonnage dropped by all Allied powers in all theaters of the Second World War combined. For every North Vietnamese soldier, the United States military-industrial complex produced, shipped, and expended literally tons of steel, high explosives, and brass. But the munitions were only part of the story. The ships also carried the mundane, the items that revealed the true nature of the American system. They carried millions of tons of cement to build airfields and bunkers. They carried enough asphalt to pave thousands of miles of roads. They carried prefabricated barracks, complete with air conditioning units. They carried entire field hospitals, sophisticated communication centers, and water purification plants. And they carried the lifeblood of this mechanized war: fuel. At the height of the war, the American military in Vietnam was consuming over 400 million gallons of petroleum products per month. This included jet fuel for the fighters and B-52s, aviation gasoline for the helicopters, and diesel and gasoline for the tens of thousands of trucks, tanks, and generators. This fuel was brought in by a fleet of supertankers to massive tank farms built along the coast, then distributed by pipelines, trucks, and even airlifted in rubber bladders by helicopter to remote fire bases. The North Vietnamese Army, by contrast, ran on an economy of extreme fuel conservation. Their few hundred Soviet and Chinese trucks on the Ho Chi Minh Trail were precious assets, used sparingly, and their total fuel consumption for their entire logistical tail was a tiny fraction of what a single American airbase used in a day. Then there was the air bridge. The United States Air Force and Army Aviation created a distribution network that was unprecedented in military history. Fleets of C-130 Hercules and C-141 Starlifters flew a constant shuttle from the Philippines, Okinawa, and the United States, carrying high-priority cargo and personnel. Within Vietnam itself, a fleet of hundreds of C-130s, C-123s, and Caribous moved men and material between the major airfields. But the true icon of American logistics in Vietnam was the helicopter. The United States deployed over 12,000 helicopters during the war. The UH One Huey became the symbol of the war itself, a multi-purpose workhorse that functioned as a troop transport, a gunship, and, crucially, a delivery truck. A single Huey could ferry a squad of infantry into a hot landing zone, and then return minutes later carrying rations, water, and ammunition. A larger CH-47 Chinook could lift an entire artillery piece, its crew, and its initial supply of shells, and place it on a remote hilltop that would have taken a North Vietnamese unit weeks to reach and fortify. This air mobility meant that no American unit was ever truly isolated. As long as a helicopter could fly, it could be resupplied. This was a concept utterly alien to the North Vietnamese soldier, who, once committed to a campaign, was dependent entirely on what he and his comrades could carry on their backs. And what did those helicopters carry? They carried the sinews of war, but they also carried the products of the American consumer economy. This was the work of the Army and Air Force Exchange Service, better known as the Post-Exchange, or PX. The PX system in Vietnam was a retail empire transplanted into a war zone. By 1968, there were dozens of large PX facilities in the rear areas, functioning essentially as department stores. They sold everything: cameras from Japan, stereo systems, watches, civilian clothing, and toiletries. The PX also distributed the small luxuries that became so psychologically significant. In a single year, 1969, the PX system sold American soldiers in Vietnam over 750 million cans of soft drinks and 500 million cans of beer. It sold billions of cigarettes and millions of candy bars. These were not government-issue items. They were consumer goods, purchased by soldiers with their pay, and supplied by a logistics chain that treated a pallet of Coca-Cola with the same priority as a pallet of hand grenades. Because the system understood that morale was as vital a commodity as ammunition. This brings us to the food. The iconic image of the soldier eating from a can is true, but it is incomplete. The ration was the baseline, the food for when nothing else was available. But the Quartermaster Corps went to extraordinary lengths to provide fresh food. This was the domain of rations, using fleets of refrigerated trucks and refrigerated shipping containers, known as reefers. The military supplied its main bases with fresh meat, vegetables, milk, and eggs flown in from the United States. Massive bakeries were constructed, producing hundreds of thousands of loaves of fresh bread daily. Mobile field kitchens could be airlifted to forward bases, allowing cooks to prepare hot meals for hundreds of men. A soldier coming back from a week-long patrol in the jungle, exhausted and covered in leeches, might sit down to a meal of steak, mashed potatoes, and gravy, followed by a slice of cake. And then there was the ice cream. The military established several ice cream plants in Vietnam. More remarkably, the United States Navy operated a floating ice cream barge that would motor up and down the rivers of the Mekong Delta, dispensing freshly made ice cream to sailors on patrol boats and soldiers at remote riverine outposts. The sheer, almost decadent audacity of it was breathtaking. It required a cold chain, a complex logistical sequence of refrigeration that stretched from the dairy farms of the American Midwest, across the Pacific Ocean, and into the heart of the jungle. The numbers told a story of inevitable material defeat. The North Vietnamese were fighting with courage, with conviction, with a profound understanding of the landscape. But they were feeding their war machine with a teaspoon, while the United States was feeding it with a fire hose. And every soldier on both sides knew it. The avalanche of data, the sheer tonnage and gallonage, can feel abstract. But on the ground, these numbers had a human face. They translated into a daily reality that shaped the perceptions and experiences of every single participant in the war, American and Vietnamese alike. For the American GI, this logistical tale was a source of immense comfort and a tangible link to the world he had left behind. It was a constant reminder that he was not alone, not abandoned. He was the tip of a very long spear, and behind him was the entire industrial and economic might of the United States. This knowledge fostered a peculiar kind of confidence, a swagger that often infuriated his enemies. A letter from a young Marine to his parents in Ohio, dated September 1968, captures this reality. He wrote, "We were out in the bush for 5 days, eating sea rats and drinking water that tasted of iodine. It was miserable. We made contact on the last day, a short, sharp firefight. When we got back to the firebase, the first thing they had for us was a cold beer. A cold Budweiser. I swear, nothing has ever tasted so good. It's funny. You can be trying to kill each other 1 minute, and an hour later you're listening to the radio and drinking a cold one. This is a strange war. That cold beer was not an accident. It was policy. It was the result of a system that understood the psychology of its soldiers. The small comforts were a deliberate tool to combat the psychological strain of a war with no front lines and no clear objectives. They were a defense mechanism against the madness of the environment. Veterans' memoirs are filled with these small, vivid details. The care package from home filled with cookies and magazines. The Bob Hope USO show with its Hollywood stars and NFL cheerleaders, flown into a massive, purpose-built amphitheater. The ability to watch a first-run movie projected onto a bedsheet hung between two trucks at a forward base. One soldier recalled the miracle of the laundry service. Units in the field would bag up their filthy, sweat-soaked jungle fatigues. A helicopter would pick them up, and 2 days later, it would return with the same clothes, washed, pressed, and neatly folded. This service was provided by vast laundry facilities operated by Vietnamese civilians under contract to the American military. It was another small part of the system, another routine miracle that separated the American experience from that of their adversary. For the Vietcong and North Vietnamese, the exposure to this system was a profound and often deeply unsettling education. It systematically dismantled the propaganda they had been fed their entire lives. They were told the enemy was weak. They discovered he was unimaginably strong. They were told the enemy was decadent. They discovered that this decadence was a weapon of incredible power. Bao Ninh, a former North Vietnamese soldier who would later become a celebrated novelist, wrote of his first encounter with a captured American firebase in his book, The Sorrow of War. He described the shock of his unit as they walked through the abandoned position. They found not just weapons and ammunition, but stacks of books and magazines, portable record players, and even a half-finished chess game. He wrote of the scent of a different world, a world of leisure, knowledge, and material comfort that stood in stark, almost violent contrast to their own lives of brutal, grinding necessity. The interrogations of captured NBA soldiers provide a clinical, official record of this psychological demolition. A report from 1969 on the debriefing of a senior lieutenant revealed his obsession with the American trash pits. The lieutenant stated, through a translator, "I saw your soldiers throw away food that was still good. They would open a can, eat half, and discard the rest. They threw away boots that needed only small repairs. They threw away batteries that were still charged. At first, I thought it was because they were undisciplined. Then I realized it is because you have so much. These things have no value to you. How can we fight a country that does not know the value of a can of fruit or a pair of boots?" This was a recurring theme. The waste was a source of constant fascination and horror. To the Vietnamese, who reused every scrap of material, who would fashion sandals from discarded truck tires and lamps from spent artillery shells, the American habit of throwing things away was a form of insanity. But it was an insanity born of a level of wealth they could not comprehend. It was the logic of a disposable society, and it was utterly demoralizing. The medical care provided to captured and wounded enemy soldiers was another powerful tool of psychological warfare, intended or not. An NBA soldier who had been taught to hate the American imperialists would have a leg wound treated by a highly trained American surgeon, be given powerful antibiotics he had never heard of, and recover in a clean bed. He would be treated with a professional detachment and a level of care that was, by any measure, humane. This act of impersonal, systemic compassion was often more effective at breaking a soldier's ideological commitment than any form of coercion. It replaced the image of the demonic enemy with the reality of a competent, well-resourced, and surprisingly gentle adversary. These individual vignettes, these moments of realization, accumulated over time. The story of the ice cream, the cold Coca-Cola, the discarded boots, the professional medical care. They were all pieces of a larger mosaic. They were the human-level evidence of the statistical avalanche. They showed that the war was not just being fought with M16s and B-52s, but with logistics, with consumer goods, with a system of abundance that promised a better life while simultaneously delivering a more efficient death. It was a war of systems, and one system was simply, undeniably, overwhelmingly superior. By 1968, the cumulative weight of this material disparity had become undeniable. The Tet Offensive was the breaking point, though not in the way it is commonly remembered. For the American public, watching the fighting on their television screens, Tet was a profound psychological shock. The sight of Vietcong sappers in the courtyard of the American embassy in Saigon shattered the official narrative that the war was being won. Politically, it was a disaster for the Johnson administration and marked the beginning of the end of American public support for the war. But on the ground, in military and logistical terms, Tet was a catastrophic, unmitigated defeat for the North Vietnamese and the Vietcong. In launching their nationwide conventional-style assault on the cities, they came out of the jungle and fought the Americans on their own terms. It was a suicidal miscalculation. The Vietcong, who bore the brunt of the fighting in the South, were effectively annihilated as a coherent fighting force. They were systematically obliterated by American firepower. Entire battalions that had taken years to recruit and train were wiped out in a matter of days. They could never be replaced. The logistical aftermath told the real story. The United States lost over 2,500 aircraft, mostly helicopters, during the fighting in 1968. This was a staggering number, but the American industrial base replaced them. New Cobras and Hueys rolled off the assembly lines at Bell Helicopters in Fort Worth, Texas, were loaded onto cargo ships, and were flying missions in Vietnam within weeks. Every lost tank, every burned-out truck, every million rounds of expended ammunition was replaced with a casual, almost contemptuous efficiency. The system barely registered the loss. For the North, the material losses were irreplaceable. They had committed their stockpiles, their best-trained units, and their political capital to a single, desperate gamble. And they had lost. They had proven they could inflict pain, that they could shock the American public. But they had also proven they could not win a conventional fight. They could not match the American machine. This realization led to a slow-motion ideological collapse among many of the enemy's senior cadres. They saw the futility of their position. This was articulated most clearly in the post-war writings of some North Vietnamese commanders. General Tran Van Tra, a senior Vietcong commander, wrote in his memoirs about the period after Tet. He admitted the severe underestimation of American firepower and, more importantly, America's ability to sustain that firepower indefinitely. He wrote, "We did not correctly evaluate the specific balance of forces between ourselves and the enemy. We set requirements that were beyond our actual strength. It was a clinical, military admission of a fundamental truth. There was not enough to overcome the enemy's wallet." The ultimate concession, however, often came in the quiet, reflective moments after the war was over. In an interview conducted years later, a former North Vietnamese colonel was asked what he thought was the most difficult aspect of fighting the Americans. His answer was not about the B-52 strikes or the napalm. He said, "The most difficult thing was to fight an enemy you knew you could never exhaust. We would destroy a convoy of their trucks. The next day, there would be a new convoy with new trucks. We would overrun a firebase and capture their artillery. The next day, helicopters would arrive and bring in new, bigger artillery. There was no end to their material. It was a river of steel. You could stand in it. You could even divert it for a moment. But you could never, ever stop it. This was the point of no return. It was the dawning horror that they were engaged in a war of attrition against an opponent with a functionally infinite capacity for attrition. They could win a battle. They could win a campaign. They could even win the political war for the hearts and minds of the American public. But they could never, ever bankrupt the American logistical system on the battlefield. They were trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. The concession was not made in a treaty or on a battlefield. It was a slow, dawning, private realization in the minds of the men who had to fight that river of steel. They realized they weren't being beaten. They were being buried. In the end, the United States did not win the war in Vietnam. The images of helicopters evacuating the roof of the embassy in Saigon in 1975 are seared into the historical memory as a symbol of American failure and defeat. And in a political sense, it was a failure. The political will of the American people to sustain the cost in blood and treasure evaporated. The domestic consensus fractured, and the war became untenable. But the central thesis of the North Vietnamese, that the pampered American soldier's spirit would break under hardship, was proven demonstrably false. The American soldier did not break. He fought bravely and effectively for a decade. The reason his spirit did not break is because the system behind him refused to allow it. The system insulated him from the true, grinding, spirit-crushing deprivation that was the daily reality for his enemy. The system delivered the mail, the hot meals, the cold beer, and the ice cream. It delivered a bubble of America into the heart of the jungle. This system was never defeated. It was, if anything, too successful. It made the war seem deceptively easy, deceptively clean from a logistical standpoint. It created a reality where 8B-52 flying from Guam could drop a string of bombs with pinpoint accuracy, refuel from an aerial tanker, and be back at its base for dinner, the crew never setting foot in the country they were bombing. It was war as an industrial process, an assembly line of destruction, and the factory was running 24 hours a day. Let's consider a final, crushing set of statistics. Over the course of the war, the United States shipped more than 25 million tons of supplies and equipment to South Vietnam. To support its 1 million Vietnamese and 500,000 American troops, the logistical pipeline delivered, on average, 850 pounds of supplies per man every single day. The average North Vietnamese soldier, by contrast, subsisted on less than 2 pounds of supplies per day, most of it rice, all of it carried on foot. The United States military built or upgraded 26 major airfields, 10 deep-water ports, and paved over 12,000 miles of highway. It operated a telephone network in South Vietnam that was second in size only to that of the Bell Telephone Company inside the continental United States. They didn't beat us with tactics. They didn't outfight us in the jungle. They didn't have a superior ideology. They buried us. They buried us in bombs and bullets and sea rations and Coca-Cola cans. They buried us under a mountain of materials so vast that it defied comprehension. This is the ultimate lesson of that war. It is a lesson about the awesome, terrifying, and decisive power of a modern industrial economy unleashed for the purposes of war. Years after the fall of Saigon, an American veteran returned to Vietnam. He traveled to the A Shau Valley, the scene of some of his most harrowing memories. There, he met a group of local villagers, among them a man his own age who had been a soldier in the North Vietnamese army. Through a translator, they spoke of the war. The American expected questions about specific battles, about weapons, about the fear and the fighting. But the Vietnamese man asked only one question. He looked the American in the eye, and with a sense of genuine, enduring wonder, he asked, "Is it true? Did you really have ice cream?" In the jungle. And in that question lies the entire story. The memory that lingered for decades was not the flash of the guns, but the quiet, impossible spectacle of a scoop of ice cream in hell. Because that small, mundane luxury explained the outcome of the war more profoundly than any battle ever could. It is the story of a war that was not lost on the battlefield, but was instead abandoned by a nation that grew tired of paying the price for its own impossible abundance. The factory won. The politicians just turned it off.